In the bitter Wyoming Territory of 1873, a pregnant widow drags firewood through knee-deep snow while her neighbors turn their backs. Clara Mae Tisdale carries more than winter fuel. She bears the weight of a dead husband's shame and a child who'll never know its father. The townsfolk whisper that Thomas Tisdale died a thief, and guilt follows bloodlines in places where survival depends on reputation. But sometimes, when the wind howls through the pines and hope seems frozen solid, Providence rides up on a black stallion. Sometimes a stranger sees past the whispers to the woman beneath the burden. Sometimes redemption comes not from forgetting the past, but from finding someone brave enough to build a future worth having. What happens when a man who's lost everything he ever loved meets a woman who's never been loved the way she deserves?
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
The morning sun cast long shadows across the frozen ground as Clara Mae Tisdale stepped out of her cabin, her breath forming small clouds in the bitter December air. At 26, she carried herself with the dignity of a woman who had learned early that life rarely offered second chances, and the gentle swell of her belly beneath her warm woolen coat spoke of hope wrapped in uncertainty. The cabin behind her, built by her husband's hands just 3 years prior, stood as a testament to dreams that had died with the man who'd wielded the hammer. She paused at the woodpile, what remained of it after weeks of bitter cold. Thomas had always kept them well stocked for winter, his careful planning one of the qualities that had drawn her to him when she was barely 18 and full of notions about love conquering all hardships. Now, with only a few scattered logs remaining, and February still stretching ahead like an unforgiving promise, Clara faced the harsh arithmetic of survival that had become her daily companion since the October morning when Sheriff Morrison had knocked on her door with news that would reshape her world. The axe felt heavy in her hands as she positioned it above a thick piece of pine. Her movements were deliberate, practiced, each swing a meditation on persistence that had carried her through the darkest months of her life. The wood split cleanly, the sharp crack echoing across the valley like a gunshot, as she found herself momentarily transported back to happier times when that same sound had meant Thomas was providing for their future, not her desperately trying to preserve her present. The rocking chair Thomas had made for her during their first winter together sat just inside the cabin door, visible through the frost-etched window. He'd carved delicate flowers into the arms and spent hours sanding every surface until it felt like silk beneath her fingers. Now it served as both comfort and reminder, a physical manifestation of the love they'd shared and the solitary life she now faced. "Morning, Clara Mae." The voice belonged to Ezra Caldwell, her nearest neighbor and one of the few souls in Millbrook who still acknowledged her existence. He stood at the edge of her property line, his weathered face bearing the kind of deep lines that came from a lifetime of squinting into prairie winds and making difficult decisions. At 62, Ezra had seen enough of life's cruelties to understand that sometimes good people found themselves trapped by circumstances beyond their control. "Morning, Ezra." She straightened, one hand instinctively moving to support her lower back where the growing child had begun to change her center of gravity. "Cold enough for you?" He chuckled, though his eyes held concern as they took in her diminished woodpile and the slight tremor in her hands that spoke of exhaustion poorly hidden. "Been colder, I reckon. Wanted to check on you before I head into town. Martha's got a pot of stew on the stove that's far too much for 2 old folks. Thought you might appreciate some." The offer carried the weight of kindness, carefully wrapped in pride-preserving dignity. Ezra and Martha Caldwell had been extending such gestures since Thomas's death, always presented as casual abundance rather than charity, allowing Clara to accept help without feeling like an object of pity. It was a delicate dance they'd perfected over the months, this preservation of her dignity while ensuring her survival. "That's thoughtful of you both," Clara replied, setting the axe aside and brushing wood shavings from her coat. "I've got some sourdough starter that's been particularly lively this week. Perhaps I could send some back with you for Martha." This was how it worked between them, this careful exchange that allowed both parties to maintain their sense of usefulness and dignity. In a land where self-reliance was often the only thing standing between a person and complete destitution, Such arrangements required a particular kind of social grace that Clara had learned to navigate with increasing skill. She'd be pleased as punch, Ezra said, then hesitated before continuing. Clara Mae, I don't like to pry into another person's business, but winter's got a ways to go yet, and that baby's going to need you strong when it decides to make its appearance. The concern in his voice was genuine, and Clara felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever anyone reminded her of just how precarious her situation had become. She was 6 months along, with dwindling supplies, no family to speak of, and a reputation that had been tarnished by association with a man who may or may not have been guilty of the crimes laid at his feet after death. I'm managing well enough, she said, though they both knew it was only partially true. The baby's not due until May, and I've got plans for making it through. Those plans mostly consisted of hope and stubbornness, with a healthy dose of prayer thrown in for good measure. But admitting such things aloud would serve no purpose, except to worry a kind man who already carried enough burdens for his own. Family. Ezra nodded, understanding passing between them like a shared language developed over months of careful conversation. Well, you know where to find us if those plans need any adjusting. Martha's already started knitting little booties, though she pretends it's just for practice. After he left, Clara returned to her wood, splitting with renewed determination. Each swing of the axe became a declaration of independence, a refusal to surrender to the circumstances that seemed determined to break her spirit. The physical labor warmed her body and quieted her mind, creating a meditative state where she could almost forget the whispers that followed her through town or the way conversations died when she entered the general store. Thomas Tisdale had been accused of rustling cattle from the Barton Ranch, a charge that had emerged only after his death in a riding accident that some folks claimed was too convenient to be entirely natural. Clara had never believed her husband capable of theft, but in a community where reputation was currency and suspicion spread faster than wildfire, the truth mattered less than perception. She had become the widow of a possible thief, and that designation had transformed her from a respected member of the community into someone to be pitied at best and avoided at worst. The morning sun climbed higher, warming her face as she worked, and Clara allowed herself a moment of gratitude for the simple pleasure of physical exertion and the satisfaction of tangible progress. The growing pile of split wood represented security, warmth, and the continuation of her small but significant act of rebellion against a world that seemed determined to see her fail. She was lost in this rhythm of work and thought when the sound of approaching hoofbeats broke through her concentration. Looking up, she saw a rider approaching from the east, his form silhouetted against the morning sky in a way that made him appear almost mythical. As he drew closer, Clara could make out the details that marked him as different from the usual travelers who passed through their valley. The horse was magnificent, a black stallion with the kind of refined bearing that spoke of careful breeding and excellent care. The rider sat with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in the saddle, his clothing well made but practical, suggesting someone with means who understood the demands of frontier life. He appeared to be in his 30s, with dark hair visible beneath his hat and a face that carried the kind of weathered handsomeness that came from years of outdoor living. As he approached, Clara became suddenly aware of her appearance hair escaping from its pins, her dress rumpled from work, sweat dampening her collar despite the cold air. She set down the axe and attempted to smooth her hair, a gesture of feminine vanity that felt almost foreign after months of purely practical living. The stranger reined in his horse at the edge of her property, his hat tipped politely as he regarded her with eyes that seemed to take in everything without judgment. There was something in his expression that Clara couldn't quite identify, a quality that suggested he was a man who had seen enough of the world to understand that appearances rarely told the full story. "Morning, ma'am," he said, his voice carrying a warm baritone that seemed to resonate in the crisp air. "I hope I'm not intruding. Name's Colt Remington. I was passing through and couldn't help but notice you working out here all alone." The name meant nothing to Clara, but something in his manner suggested breeding and education, the kind of polished confidence that came from a life of privilege and opportunity. Yet there was no condescension in his tone, no sense that he viewed her circumstances anything other than what they were, a woman doing what needed to be done. "Clara Mae Tisdale," she replied, offering a small curtsy that felt oddly formal given the circumstances. "And you're not intruding. This is hardly private property in the usual sense." Colt Remington dismounted with fluid grace, moving with the kind of unconscious athleticism that spoke of years in the saddle. Up close, Clara could see that his clothes were indeed well made. His boots crafted from leather that had never known want, his coat tailored in a way that suggested city origins despite its practical cut. Mighty cold morning for such heavy work, he observed, his eyes taking in the axe, the pile of split wood, and Clara's obvious exhaustion. "You've got quite a stack built up there." There was no pity in his voice, no suggestion that a pregnant woman shouldn't be doing such labor. Instead, his tone carried the kind of respectful acknowledgement that one might offer to any person engaged in honest work, and Clara found herself appreciating his approach more than she might have expected. "Winter doesn't ask whether you're ready for it," she replied, echoing something Thomas used to say during their first autumn together. "It just arrives and expects you to manage." Colt smiled at this, an expression that transformed his face from merely handsome to genuinely attractive. "Wise words. Sounds like something my grandfather might have said. He always claimed that winter was God's way of separating the truly determined from those who were just pretending to be strong." The conversation felt natural despite their being strangers, as if they were old acquaintances catching up rather than two people meeting for the first time. Clara found herself responding to his easy manner, her usual guardedness softening in the face of his apparent sincerity. "Are you just passing through, Mr. Remington? Or do you have business in these parts?" she asked, genuinely curious about what might bring such a well-appointed stranger to their isolated valley. "Bit of both, actually," he replied, his eyes scanning the horizon as if taking measure of the land itself. "I've been looking at property in the area, considering some investments. This is beautiful country, though I suspect it's not always easy living." Clara followed his gaze across the valley, seeing it momentarily through the eyes of someone encountering it for the first time. The landscape was indeed beautiful, with its rolling hills dotted with pine and aspen, the distant mountains providing a dramatic backdrop that changed color with the shifting light. But beauty didn't keep you warm in February, or put food on the table when supplies ran low. "It's got its challenges," she admitted. "But there's something to be said for a place that demands your best efforts, makes you appreciate what you've got." As they spoke, Clara became aware of how long it had been since she'd had a conversation with someone who wasn't motivated by either pity or judgment. Colt Remington seemed genuinely interested in what she had to say, his questions thoughtful and his responses suggesting he was actually listening rather than simply waiting for his turn to speak. The morning stretched on, the sun climbing higher and beginning to warm the air enough that Clara could feel sweat gathering beneath her heavy coat. She should be inviting him to move along, getting back to her work, maintaining the kind of proper distance that a widow in her position was expected to observe. Instead, she found herself reluctant to end a conversation that had become the most pleasant part of her day and longer than she cared to remember. "I should let you get back to your work," Colt said eventually, as if reading her thoughts. "But I wonder if I might ask you something." Clara nodded, curious about what had prompted the slight change in his demeanor, the way his expression had become more serious. "This is going to sound forward, and I hope you'll forgive the presumption," he began, his voice carrying a new note of careful consideration. "But I've been looking for someone with local knowledge to help me understand this area better. Someone who knows the land, the people, the way things work around here. Would you be interested in such an arrangement?" The offer was unexpected, and Clara felt her heart skip slightly as she considered the implications. Work meant income, and income meant security for herself and her unborn child. But it also meant prolonged contact with this stranger and her. Situation was already precarious enough without adding complications. "What kind of help are you looking for?" she asked cautiously, aware that her answer would likely determine more than just her immediate future. "Guidance, mostly," Colt replied. "I'm a city man trying to understand country ways. Someone to show me the good land from the poor, Introduce me to the right people. Help me avoid the mistakes that outsiders typically make when they try to establish themselves in a new place. It was a reasonable request, and Clara found herself considering the practical aspects, even as another part of her mind catalogued all the reasons why accepting would be complicated. A woman in her position needed to be careful about her associations, particularly with unmarried men of apparent wealth and questionable motivation. I appreciate the offer, she said finally, but I'm not sure I'm the right person for such work. My circumstances are ... complicated. Colt's expression softened, and Clara realized he had probably already heard the whispers about her husband's alleged crimes and her resulting social isolation. In a valley this small, news traveled fast, and a stranger asking questions would quickly learn everything there was to know about the local scandals. Mrs. Tisdale, he said quietly, I've found that the most honest guidance often comes from people who understand what it means to be judged unfairly. Your circumstances, whatever they might be, don't change the fact that you know this land and these people better than any outsider could hope to. The words carried a weight that suggested personal experience with judgment and social exclusion, and Clara found herself studying his face more carefully, looking for clues about what might have shaped his perspective. There was something in his eyes, a shadow of old pain that suggested he understood isolation from the inside, rather than merely as an observer. 3 days after her encounter with Colt Remington, Clara Mae found herself standing in the doorway of Morrison's general store, steeling herself for the weekly ritual of grocery shopping that had become an exercise in endurance rather than simple commerce. The bell above the door announced her arrival with a cheerful jingle that seemed to mock the sudden silence that fell over the assembled customers like a heavy curtain dot in her worn leather pouch. Clara carried the last of her carefully hoarded coins, barely enough for the essentials that would see her through another week. Each coin represented a choice between warmth and food, between present comfort and future security, between her pride and her baby's needs. Mrs. Abigail Morrison looked up from her ledger behind the counter, her thin lips pressing into the kind of smile that managed to convey both obligation and disapproval in equal measure. At 55, Abigail had appointed herself the moral guardian of Millbrook's social order, and Clara's presence in her store represented a challenge to the neat categories she preferred to maintain. Morning, Clara Mae, she said, her voice carrying the particular tone reserved for people who existed on the periphery of respectability. What can I help you with today? Clara straightened her shoulders and moved toward the counter with the measured dignity she had perfected over months of similar encounters. Good morning, Mrs. Morrison. I need some flour, salt, and if you have any dried beans that aren't too dear, I'd appreciate a look at them. The other customers, Martha Henley with her twin daughters, old Joe Bracken picking up supplies for his mining claim, and the Reverend Patterson's wife Sarah continued their shopping with exaggerated normalcy. But Clara could feel their attention, like a physical weight. In a community of fewer than 200 souls, every interaction carried the potential for entertainment, judgment, or both. Flour's gone up again, Mrs. Morrison announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. Supply wagons have been having trouble with the weather. 28 cents a pound now. The price was nearly double what Clara had paid in October, and she felt her carefully budgeted plans crumble like old paper. 28 cents a pound meant her money would stretch perhaps half as far as she'd hoped, leaving her with choices that weren't really choices at all. She fingered the coins in her pouch, each one now precious beyond measure. I see, she said quietly, her mind rapidly recalculating what she could afford and what she could do without. Perhaps just 5 pounds then, and I'll make do. Martha Henley stepped closer to the counter, her expression carrying the kind of sympathetic concern that often preceded unwelcome advice. Clara Mae, honey, you know if you're having trouble making ends meet, the church auxiliary has been discussing ways to help our neighbors in need. Nobody would think less of you for accepting a little assistance during your condition. The offer was well-intentioned, but it carried implications that made Clara's chest tighten with a mixture of gratitude and defensive pride. Accepting help from the church auxiliary would mean public acknowledgement of her desperate circumstances, official recognition that she had moved from the category of respectable widow to object of charity. "That's very kind of you, Martha," Clara replied, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart. "But I'm managing fine. The baby's not due for months yet, and I've got plans for getting through the winter." Sarah Patterson, a woman whose husband's position gave her opinions extra weight in community discussions, moved closer with the air of someone about to deliver moral guidance. "Clara Mae, dear, there's no shame in accepting help when you're carrying a child. But perhaps this is God's way of encouraging you to think about your future more practically. There are good families who would welcome a child, especially if the mother were to, well, if circumstances were different." The suggestion hit Clara like a physical blow, though she managed to keep her expression neutral. Sarah Patterson was suggesting she give up her baby for adoption, framing it as Christian charity, while delivering what amounted to a judgment on her fitness as a mother. Clara's hand moved instinctively to her belly, where the child within stirred as if responding to the threat. "My child will be staying with me," Clara said, her voice carrying a note of steel that made several people look up from their shopping. "I appreciate your concern, but that's not a path I'm considering." The tension in the store grew thicker, and Clara realized she had reached one of those moments that would define how the community viewed her going forward. She could either retreat, apologize for her firmness, and accept the role of grateful supplicant they seemed determined to assign her, or she could stand her ground and accept the consequences of being seen as prideful and ungrateful. Before she could decide which path to take, the bell above the door chimed again, and Colt Remington stepped into the store with the kind of presence that immediately shifted the social dynamics of the space. He was dressed as he had been during their first meeting, well-made clothes that spoke of means without ostentation, and he carried himself with the confident ease of a man accustomed to being welcomed wherever he went. "Good morning, everyone," he said, his warm voice filling the store with a different kind of energy. His eyes found Clara's almost immediately, and she saw recognition along with something that might have been concern. "Mrs. Tisdale, what a pleasure to see you again." The use of her name, spoken without hesitation or judgment, sent a ripple of curiosity through the assembled customers. Here was a stranger, obviously a man of some importance, treating Clara Mae Tisdale with the kind of respectful familiarity usually reserved for people of good standing in the community. "Mr. Remington," Clara replied, grateful for the interruption, even as she wondered what had brought him to the general store at this particular moment. "I hope you're finding everything you need in our town." "More than I hoped for, actually," he said, moving closer to the counter where she stood. "I was wondering if you'd had a chance to consider that conversation we had the other day about local guidance and such." The question was asked casually, but Clara could sense the attention of everyone in the store sharpening like a blade. Here was information that could reshape how they viewed her as stranger-seeking. Her advice suggested she possessed knowledge and skills that might be valuable. "I've been giving it thought," Clara replied carefully, aware that her answer would likely be discussed and analyzed long after they'd both left the store. "It's not a decision I wanted to make hastily." Colt nodded as if this were exactly the kind of careful consideration he'd expected from her. "Of course, these things require proper thought, but I hope you'll consider it favorably. I've spoken with several people around town, and your name consistently comes up as someone who really understands this valley and its people." This was news to Clara, who had assumed her social isolation meant nobody would recommend her for anything. But she could see from the expressions around her that Colt's words carried weight with people who had been prepared to dismiss her just moments earlier. Mrs. Morrison, clearly curious about this development, inserted herself into the conversation with the practiced ease of someone who made it her business to know everyone else's affairs. "Mr. Remington, isn't it? I heard you were staying at the hotel, looking at property investments. What kind of guidance were you hoping to get from Clara Mae? The kind that only comes from someone who's lived here long enough to understand the rhythms of the place." Colt replied smoothly, "I'm a city man trying to learn country ways. Mrs. Tisdale strikes me as someone who could help me avoid the mistakes outsiders typically make." The explanation was reasonable and professional, but Clara could see the wheels turning in Mrs. Morrison's mind, calculating the implications of a wealthy stranger seeking Clara's advice and what that might mean for her standing in the community. "That's interesting," Mrs. Morrison said, her tone suggesting she was still processing this new information. Clara Mae, you never mentioned you were considering taking on consulting work. It only came up recently, Clara replied, realizing that she was being pushed toward a decision, whether she was ready or not. The conversation had reached a point where backing down would suggest she lacked confidence in her own abilities, while accepting would mean committing to an arrangement she hadn't fully considered. Colt seemed to sense her dilemma, because he stepped slightly closer and lowered his voice just enough to create a sense of privacy without excluding the others entirely. Mrs. Tisdale, I know this is sudden, but I find myself in need of some immediate guidance. I'm looking at the old Henderson place this afternoon, and I'd value your opinion on the property's potential. Would you be available to accompany me? The Henderson place had been abandoned for 2 years, ever since old Jim Henderson had died, and his children had moved back east rather than try to maintain a ranch they'd never understood. It was good land, well-watered and protected from the worst of the winter winds, but it would require significant investment to restore it to productivity. Ah, yes, I suppose I could do that, Clara heard herself saying, though part of her mind was still catching up with the rapid turn of events. When were you planning to look at it? This afternoon, if that suits you. Say around 2 o'clock? I could pick you up in my buggy, if that would be convenient. The offer was made with such casual professionalism that it took Clara a moment to realize he was essentially offering to pay her for her time and expertise, while also solving her immediate transportation needs. More importantly, he was doing it in front of witnesses who would carry word of the arrangement throughout the community. That would be fine, she said, feeling as if she were stepping off a cliff into unknown territory. I'll be ready at 2. As if to seal the arrangement, Colt turned to Mrs. Morrison with the kind of smile that wealthy men used to ensure good service. Mrs. Morrison, I'll need to settle up my account before I leave town. Mrs. Tisdale, is there anything you need today that I could add to my purchase? The offer was made so smoothly that it took everyone a moment to understand what he was suggesting. Here was a stranger offering to pay for Clara's groceries, as if such generosity were the most natural thing in the world. That's very kind, Clara said, her face warming with embarrassment and gratitude in equal measure, but I can manage my own purchases. Of course you can, Colt replied, his tone suggesting he'd never doubted her capability. But I find that good business relationships often begin with small gestures of mutual respect. Consider it in advance on your consultation fee. The way he framed it transformed what could have been charity into a business transaction, allowing Clara to accept help without sacrificing her dignity. It was a masterful bit of social maneuvering that left everyone in the store slightly off balance while providing Clara with exactly what she needed most. In that case, she said, her voice steadier now, I believe I had mentioned flour, salt, and dried beans. Mrs. Morrison, clearly struggling to keep up with the rapidly changing dynamics of the situation, began gathering the requested items with unusual efficiency. The other customers watched with barely concealed fascination as this stranger effectively rescued Clara Mae Tisdale from her financial predicament while simultaneously elevating her social status through his obvious respect for her abilities. Excellent, Colt said, pulling out a leather wallet that looked expensive even to Clara's untrained eye. Mrs. Morrison, please add whatever Mrs. Tisdale needs to my account, and perhaps you could recommend a good place to get lunch before our appointment this afternoon? As the business of purchasing and packing continued around them, Clara found herself observing Colt with new attention. His intervention had been perfectly timed, smoothly executed, and designed to achieve maximum benefit for her with minimum embarrassment. It suggested either remarkable intuition or careful planning, and she wasn't sure which possibility intrigued her more. When they finally stepped outside together, Clara's arms full of packages she hadn't expected to be able to afford, she turned to him with questions that demanded answers. Mr. Remington, she began, but he held up a hand to stop her. Colt, please. And before you ask, yes, I did come to the store specifically to find you. I spoke with your neighbor, Mr. Caldwell, this morning, and he mentioned you typically did your shopping on Thursdays. I hoped I might catch you there and continue our conversation from the other day. The admission was honest enough to be disarming, but it raised new questions about his motivations and methods. "You sought me out?" "I did. And I'm glad I arrived." When I did, that conversation was heading in a direction that wouldn't have served anyone well. Clara studied his face, looking for signs of the calculation that must have gone into his timing and approach. "You orchestrated that entire scene, didn't you? The job offer, the advance payment, all of it." Colt's expression grew serious, and for a moment she glimpsed something deeper than the confident exterior he'd maintained. "Mrs. Tisdale, I came to that store to offer you honest work that you're well qualified to perform. Everything else was simply a matter of timing and opportunity. I believe in taking advantage of both when they present themselves." "And what do you believe you're taking advantage of?" Clara asked, aware that her tone had grown sharper. "The chance to help someone who deserves better than she's been getting," he replied quietly. "And perhaps the opportunity to learn from someone who understands what it means to face impossible odds with grace and determination." The words carried a sincerity that made Clara's defensive instincts waver. She had grown accustomed to parsing every kindness for hidden motivations, but something in Colt's manner suggested his interest in helping her might be genuine. "I'll be ready at 2, she said finally, adjusting her grip on the packages. "And Mr. Remington ... Colt ... thank you for the business, the advance, and the way you handled things in there. Thank you for giving me the chance to prove I'm worthy of your trust," he replied, tipping his hat as he had done during their first meeting. "I'll see you this afternoon." As Clara walked home, her mind buzzed with questions about what had just occurred and what it might mean for her future. The encounter in the store had shifted something fundamental in her relationship with the community, but it had also bound her to a man whose motivations remained largely mysterious. The Henderson place sat in a natural valley about 3 miles northeast of Clara's cabin, its abandoned buildings casting long shadows in the afternoon sun. As Colt's buggy rolled through the property gate, Clara found herself remembering the last time she'd visited here, when Jim Henderson was still alive and hosting the annual harvest dance that brought together families from all over the valley. Deed to this property represented more than mere ownership. It held the dreams of a family who had believed they could tame this wild land, and now it offered the possibility that someone else might succeed where they had failed. Clara had seen enough frontier failures to understand the weight of such documents, how they could represent either salvation or ruin, depending on the wisdom and determination of their holders. "Tell me what you see," Colt said as he brought the horses to a stop near the main house, his voice carrying the tone of someone genuinely interested in her assessment, rather than simply testing her. Knowledge. Clara stepped down from the buggy and took a moment to survey the property with fresh eyes, considering it not as the site of happy memories, but as a potential investment. The main house was solidly built, its log construction still sound despite 2 years of neglect. The barn would need significant work, but its foundation remained true, and the corrals could be rebuilt without major expense. Good bones, she sighed, walking toward the house with the measured gait of someone evaluating rather than reminiscing. Jim Henderson knew what he was doing when he chose this spot. The house faces south for maximum winter sun, but those cottonwoods will provide shade come summer. The well's deep and reliable. I remember him bragging that it never went dry even during the drought of '71. Colt followed her observations with obvious attention, occasionally asking questions that revealed his unfamiliarity with ranch operations while demonstrating his willingness to learn. Clara found herself slipping into the role of teacher, explaining the practical considerations that meant the difference between success and failure on the frontier. "The pasture land extends about a mile in each direction," she continued, gesturing toward the rolling grassland that stretched beyond the buildings. "It's good grazing, well watered by that creek that runs along the eastern boundary. Henderson ran about 200 head of cattle here, but the land could support more with proper management." "What kind of investment would it take to make this place productive again?" Colt asked, his tone suggesting this was more than idle curiosity. Clara considered the question carefully, drawing on years of watching Thomas evaluate similar properties and listening to conversations between ranchers about the costs of establishing and maintaining cattle operations. "Depends on what you're hoping to accomplish. If you want to start small, maybe 50 head to begin with, you'd need to invest in fencing, some basic equipment, and hired help during roundup and branding season. Figure maybe $3,000 to get started properly. The amount represented more money than Clara had seen in her entire life, but she could tell from Colt's expression that it fell within the range of what he considered reasonable. His casual acceptance of such figures reinforced her sense that he came from a world where money was a tool rather than a constant source of anxiety. And if someone wanted to think bigger? He asked, moving closer to examine the construction of the barn more closely. Well, Clara said, warming to the subject despite herself, this valley could support a much larger operation. There's talk that the railroad might extend a spur line through here within the next few years. If that happens, you'd have direct access to markets in Denver and beyond. A man with vision and capital could build something significant here. As they explored the property together, Clara found herself impressed by Colt's questions and observations. He approached the evaluation with the methodical thoroughness of someone accustomed to making important decisions based on careful analysis rather than emotion or impulse. Yet there was something in his manner that suggested this wasn't merely a business transaction for him. He seemed genuinely drawn to the idea of building something permanent and meaningful. Mrs. Tisdale, he said as they stood on the porch of the main house, looking out over the valley, I hope you won't think me presumptuous, but I'm curious about your own situation. This baby you're carrying, have you given thought to what kind of life you'll be able to provide? The question was personal enough to be inappropriate under normal circumstances, but something in his tone suggested genuine concern rather than idle curiosity. Clara found herself considering how to answer without revealing the full extent of her vulnerability. I'm managing as best I can, she said carefully. The cabin Thomas built is sound, and I've got enough put aside to get through the worst of winter. Beyond that, I suppose I'll figure things out as I go. Colt nodded thoughtfully, his eyes scanning the horizon as if considering possibilities she couldn't see. It's none of my business, of course, but it seems to me that a woman with your knowledge and capabilities might have options beyond simple survival. Have you ever considered that your expertise might be worth more than you realize? The suggestion carried implications that Clara wasn't sure she understood. What do you mean? This consultation today, for instance. Your assessment of this property is worth a great deal to me. You've probably saved me from making expensive mistakes, and you've helped me understand opportunities I might have missed. That kind of knowledge has real value in the marketplace. Clara felt a flush of pride at his words, though she tried to maintain her practical perspective. I appreciate the compliment, but I'm not sure there's much call for that kind of work. Around here, most folks have been on their land long enough to know what they're dealing with. Perhaps not locally, Colt agreed, but there are always newcomers looking to establish themselves. Investors from back east who need guidance from someone who understands frontier realities. A person with your background could build quite a reputation as a consultant if she approached it systematically. The idea was intriguing, though Clara wasn't sure how realistic it might be for someone in her circumstances. Still, the conversation was opening her mind to possibilities she'd never considered, ways of thinking about her knowledge and experience as assets rather than simply survival tools. As the afternoon wore on, they continued their exploration of the property, with Clara pointing out details that would matter to a prospective buyer and Colt asking increasingly sophisticated questions about ranching operations and local business conditions. Clara found herself enjoying the intellectual challenge of the work, the satisfaction of being valued for her expertise, rather than pitied for her circumstances. There's one more thing I'd like your opinion on, Colt said as they prepared to leave. If someone were to purchase this property and begin restoring it, what kind of help would they need? Not just laborers, but someone who could oversee the operation, make sure things were done properly. Clara considered the question, though she sensed there was more to it than simple curiosity. They'd need someone who understands cattle, knows the local suppliers and markets, can judge character well enough to hire good help, someone who could serve as a bridge between an outsider's money and the community's knowledge. Someone like you, in other words. The suggestion hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Clara wasn't sure she was ready to consider. The idea of steady employment, of using her skills in work that mattered, was almost too appealing to contemplate seriously. "I suppose," she said slowly, "though I'm not sure how practical that would be for someone in my condition." "Your condition being that you're expecting a child?" "That and ... Clara gestured vaguely, encompassing all the social complications. That made her situation so precarious. "Mrs. Tisdale," Holt said quietly, "I've found that the most valuable employees are often those who have something to prove. Someone who's been underestimated by others, who's had to fight for everything they've accomplished, tends to bring a level of dedication and insight that you simply can't buy." The words carried a conviction that suggested personal experience, and Clara found herself wondering what challenges had shaped Colt's perspective on such matters. There was clearly more to his story than the successful businessman facade. Presented to the world. As they drove back toward her cabin, Clara reflected on the afternoon's revelations. What had begun as a simple consultation had evolved into something that felt like a job interview, though she wasn't entirely sure for what position. More importantly, she had rediscovered something she'd almost forgotten, the satisfaction of being valued for her mind rather than simply endured as an object of charity. "I want to thank you for today," Colt said as they approached her cabin. "Your insights about the Henderson place will be invaluable in helping me make the right decision." "It was my pleasure," Clara replied, and realized she meant it. "I'd forgotten how good it feels to put my knowledge to productive use." "Well, I hope you'll consider that there might be opportunities for more such work in the future. I'll be making a decision about the Henderson place within the next few days, and if I proceed, I'll definitely need ongoing guidance from someone who understands the local situation." As Clara climbed down from the buggy, her mind was already working through the practical implications of what he was suggesting. Regular employment would mean security for herself and her child, but it would also mean a much deeper relationship with a man whose motivations and background remained largely mysterious. "I'll give it serious thought," she said, though part of her had already begun to hope that his interest in the property would lead to the opportunities he was hinting at. "That's all I can ask," Colt replied. "I'll be in touch soon." As he drove away, Clara stood watching until the buggy disappeared over the ridge, her mind spinning with possibilities she hadn't dared to consider just hours earlier. The afternoon had reminded her that she possessed valuable skills and knowledge, but more importantly, it had shown her that there might be ways to build a future that went beyond mere survival. Inside her cabin, she settled into Thomas's rocking chair and placed her hands on her growing belly, feeling the baby's responsive movements. For the first time since learning of her pregnancy, Clara allowed herself to imagine a future where her child might grow up with real opportunities, where their life together might be shaped by hope rather than desperation. The deed to the Henderson place might change hands soon, but Clara was beginning to understand that the real transformation might be in her own life, in the recognition that she had more to offer the world than she'd realized. Whether that recognition would lead to the security and respect she craved remained to be seen, but for the first time in months, Clara Mae Tisdale felt genuinely optimistic about what tomorrow might bring. Over the following weeks, Clara's life settled into a rhythm she hadn't experienced since Thomas's death, one marked by purpose rather than mere survival. Colt had indeed purchased the Henderson place, and with it came the consulting arrangement he'd proposed. Every few days, he would arrive at her cabin with questions about suppliers, local customs, or the character of potential employees, always carrying his leather-bound journal where he meticulously recorded her advice alongside his own observations and plans. The journal itself had become a familiar sight, its well-worn cover suggesting it had accompanied him through many business ventures. Clara had glimpsed enough of its contents to see that Colt approached every decision with careful analysis, documenting not just facts and figures, but his assessments of people and situations. It was the tool of a man who had learned to rely on thorough preparation rather than luck or intuition. "Mrs. Tisdale," he said one crisp February morning as they stood in what would soon become the renovated Henderson barn, "I've received responses to the job notices we posted in Denver and Cheyenne. I'd value your opinion on which candidates might be worth interviewing. Clara accepted the bundle of letters he offered, noting how naturally the word "we" had entered his vocabulary when discussing the ranch operations. Over the past month, she had evolved from consultant to something approaching partner in the planning process, her insights increasingly central to the decisions that would shape the property's future. The first letter was from a man, claiming extensive experience with cattle operations in Texas. His credentials impressive on paper, but his tone suggesting the kind of arrogance that often accompanied men who viewed the frontier as a place to escape consequences rather than build something meaningful. The second came from a younger man, recently arrived from Ireland, whose honesty about his limited experience was more appealing than the boastful claims of more seasoned applicants. "This one," Clara said, tapping the letter from the Irish immigrant, "Patrick O'Sullivan. He's green, but he's honest about it, and he's asking thoughtful questions about the specific challenges of Wyoming ranching. A man who asks good questions usually learns faster than one who thinks he already knows everything." Colt nodded, making a note in his journal. "My instinct as well. What about for the foreman position?" Clara considered the remaining applications, weighing not just the stated qualifications, but the character revealed in how each man presented himself. The decision mattered more than Colt might realize. The wrong foreman could poison relationships with neighboring ranchers and make it difficult to hire good seasonal help. "Jake Morrison," she said finally, selecting a letter from a man who had worked for several respected outfits in the territory. "I know his reputation. He's steady, fair with the men under him, and he understands that a ranch's success depends as much on good relationships with neighbors as good management of cattle." "Morrison?" Colt looked up from his journal with interest. "Any relation to the woman who runs the general store?" "Her nephew, which might complicate things, given how she's treated me in the past, but Jake's cut from different cloth. He judges people by their actions rather than their associations." The observation led to a broader conversation about the social dynamics of their small community, how personal relationships and family connections influenced everything from business dealings to social standing. Clara found herself sharing insights about local personalities and politics that she'd never had occasion to discuss with anyone else, knowledge that had seemed irrelevant to her own survival, but proved invaluable to someone trying to establish himself as a respected member of the community. "You know," Colt said as they walked back toward his buggy, "I've been thinking about the arrangements between us. This consulting work has proven far more valuable than I initially anticipated, and I feel like the compensation we agreed upon doesn't reflect the true worth of your contributions." Clara felt a familiar flutter of anxiety at the mention of money, though their financial relationship had been one of the most positive aspects of their arrangement. Colt paid her promptly and generously for her time, allowing her to build up a modest reserve that provided security she hadn't known since Thomas's death. "Unsatisfied with our current arrangement," she said carefully, unsure where this conversation might be heading. "Perhaps, but I'm not. The ranch is going to require ongoing management and oversight, someone who can serve as my representative when I'm away on business. I'd like to offer you a more formal position, with a regular salary rather than these ad hoc consulting fees." The proposal was more than Clara had dared to hope for, yet it also raised practical concerns she couldn't ignore. "What kind of position are you suggesting?" "Ranch manager, essentially. Someone who could oversee daily operations, make decisions about hiring and purchasing, serve as the liaison with other ranchers and local businesses. The kind of role that would require your presence at the ranch most days, at least during the active season." Clara considered the implications, both positive and problematic. Regular employment would provide unprecedented security for herself and her baby, but it would also mean a much more public role in the community and a closer working relationship with Colt that might attract unwelcome speculation. "That's very generous," she said slowly, "but I'm not sure how practical it would be. My condition will become more obvious as the months progress, and there's the baby to consider once it arrives." "I've thought about that," Colt replied, his tone suggesting he'd given the matter considerable consideration. "The ranch house has several unused rooms that could be converted into comfortable living quarters. You could bring the baby to work with you, at least while it's young enough to require constant care. Later, We could arrange for help with childcare during working hours. The offer was so comprehensive, so carefully thought out, that Clara wondered how long he'd been planning to make it. The idea of living at the ranch, of having a real home for her child, rather than the increasingly cramped cabin, was almost overwhelming in its appeal. "Why?" she asked finally. "You could hire any number of men with more experience. People without the complications that come with my situation." Colt was quiet for a moment, his eyes scanning the horizon as if considering how much to reveal. "Mrs. Tisdale, I've built my success on recognizing valuable assets that others have overlooked or undervalued. You possess a combination of local knowledge, practical wisdom, and natural intelligence that would be impossible to replicate by hiring someone from outside the community. More than that, you have something that can't be taught: the integrity. That comes from having faced real hardship without compromising your principles." The words carried a weight that suggested personal conviction rather than mere business calculation, and Clara found herself moved by his confidence in her abilities. Yet she also sensed there was more to his motivation than he was revealing, something that went beyond the practical benefits of her local knowledge. "I need time to think about it," she said, though part of her wanted to accept immediately. "Of course. It's a significant decision, and you shouldn't make it hastily. But I hope you'll consider that this could represent more than just employment. It could be the foundation for building the kind of life you want for yourself and your child." As Clara walked back to her cabin that evening, her mind wrestled with the magnitude of what Colt was offering. The position would transform her from a struggling widow into a woman of substance and responsibility, someone whose opinions carried weight in community affairs. Yet it would also bind her fate more closely to a man whose own story remained largely mysterious. Inside her cabin, she settled into the rocking chair that had become her place for serious contemplation, her hands resting on her growing belly as she considered the choice before her. The baby was becoming more active as her pregnancy progressed, responding to her emotional states with increased movement that seemed to reflect her own restless energy. The practical benefits of Colt's offer were undeniable. A regular salary would provide security she'd never known, even during her marriage to Thomas. Living at the ranch would give her child a better environment than the isolated cabin, with more space and the stimulation that came from being part of an active enterprise. Most importantly, the work itself appealed to her in ways she was only beginning to understand: the satisfaction of using her mind and skills to build something meaningful. Yet accepting would also mean acknowledging that her old life was truly over, that the future she'd planned with Thomas was impossible to reclaim. It would mean embracing a new identity as Colt Remington's ranch manager rather than Thomas Tisdale's widow, a transition that felt both liberating and frightening. Over the next few days, Clara found herself paying closer attention to how the community responded to her association with Colt and his ranch project. The change in people's attitudes had been gradual, but unmistakable. Shopkeepers now greeted her with genuine courtesy. Neighbors stopped to ask her opinion on local matters, and even Mrs. Morrison had begun treating her with something approaching respect. The transformation had been driven largely by Colt's obvious regard for her abilities and his public acknowledgement of her value as a consultant. In a community where social standing was often determined by association, his respect had elevated her status more effectively than any amount of charitable assistance could have done. Still, Clara was careful not to misinterpret the nature of their relationship. Colt treated her with unfailing courtesy and professional respect, but he maintained the kind of appropriate boundaries that suggested he understood the potential complications of their situation. He was offering her employment, not romantic involvement, and she was determined to keep those distinctions clear in her own mind. The decision, when it finally came, arrived not through careful analysis, but through a moment of sudden clarity. Clara was visiting the Henderson place to assess the progress of the renovation work when she found herself standing in what would soon be her office, looking out over the valley through windows that Colt had specifically positioned to provide a best view of the ranch operations. "This could be yours," she whispered to the baby, her hand moving to her belly as she imagined her child growing up here, learning about responsibility and hard work from watching a successful enterprise in action. "We could build something here, something that would last." When Colt arrived an hour later, Clara was ready with her answer dot by early March. Clara had settled into her new quarters at the Henderson Ranch with a sense of belonging she hadn't experienced since the early days of her marriage. The rooms Colt had prepared for her were more spacious and comfortable than anywhere she'd ever lived, with large windows that filled the space with natural light and a small sitting area where she could work on correspondence and planning during the quieter hours of the day. It was in this sitting area that Clara had arranged her mother's china tea set, one of the few precious items she'd brought from her old life. The delicate porcelain cups and saucers, painted with tiny blue flowers, had been her mother's pride and represented the genteel life Clara had known before marrying Thomas and moving to the frontier. Now they served as a bridge between her past and present, a reminder that elegance and refinement could exist even in the rugged circumstances of ranch life. "Mrs. Tisdale," Colt said one afternoon as he found her reviewing supply invoices in her sitting area, "I wonder if I might impose upon your hospitality for tea this evening. I've received some correspondence from Chicago that I'd like to discuss with you, and I find these business conversations go better in comfortable surroundings." The request was carefully phrased to maintain appropriate propriety while acknowledging the growing personal dimension of their working relationship. Over the past weeks, their daily consultations had evolved beyond simple business matters into conversations that touched on their respective backgrounds, hopes for the ranch's future, and the broader challenges of building a life on the frontier. "Of course," Clara replied, pleased by the opportunity to use her mother's china for its intended purpose. "Shall we say 7 o'clock?" That evening, Clara prepared for their meeting with more care than she'd taken with her appearance in months. She chose her best dress, a deep blue wool that complemented her coloring and had been altered to accommodate her expanding figure. Her hair was arranged in a style that was both practical and becoming, and she allowed herself a small amount of the rose water she'd been hoarding since Christmas. When Colt arrived, she was struck by how naturally he fit into the domestic setting she'd created. His usual business attire had been replaced by more casual clothing that suggested this was as much a social call as a professional meeting, and he carried himself with the relaxed confidence of a man comfortable in refined surroundings. "This is lovely," he said, admiring the tea service as Clara poured from the delicate china pot. "The cups are particularly beautiful. Family pieces?" "My mother's," Clara replied, pleased that he'd noticed the quality of the porcelain. "One of the few things I brought from home when I married Thomas. I've been saving them for special occasions, though I'm beginning to think that was foolish. Beautiful things should be used and enjoyed, not hidden away." "Wise philosophy," Colt agreed, accepting his cup with the careful handling that showed he understood its value. "I've learned that life's pleasures are often more fragile than we realize, and postponing them indefinitely usually means missing them entirely." The comment carried a note of personal experience that made Clara curious about what losses might have shaped his perspective, but she didn't press for details. Instead, she allowed the conversation to develop naturally as they settled into the comfortable rhythm that had characterized their best discussions. "You mentioned correspondence from Chicago," she said, noting that Colt seemed less relaxed than his casual manner suggested. "Yes," he replied, his expression growing more serious. "My business partners back east have been pressing me about my extended absence from our operations there. They're concerned that my focus on this ranch project might be affecting my attention to our other investments." Clara felt a flutter of anxiety at the implication. "Are you considering returning to Chicago?" "Not permanently," Colt said quickly, as if he'd anticipated her concern. "But I may need to make periodic trips back east to maintain those relationships and oversee certain aspects of our business. That's one reason why having you here as ranch manager has become so important. I need someone I can trust to maintain operations in my absence." The reassurance was welcome, but Clara sensed there was more to the situation than he was revealing. "These partners of yours, are they supportive of your investment here?" Colt was quiet for a moment, turning his teacup thoughtfully in its saucer. "Some are, others less so. There's a faction that views frontier investments as too risky, too removed from established markets and reliable returns. They'd prefer to focus on more conservative opportunities in established cities." "And what do you think?" "I think they're missing the bigger picture," Colt replied with conviction. The frontier represents the future of this country, and the men who establish themselves here now will reap enormous benefits as the region develops. But more than that ... He paused, looking out the window toward the valley where the ranch's first cattle were settling into their new home. I think there's value in building something real, something that contributes to the growth of a community, rather than simply extracting profit from existing enterprises. The sentiment revealed a side of Colt that Clara found increasingly appealing, a man who understood that true success meant more than financial gain. It also suggested why he might have felt drawn to leave the business world of Chicago for the challenges and opportunities of Wyoming Territory. That sounds like the perspective of someone who's grown tired of city life, Clara observed. Perhaps, Colt admitted. Chicago has given me many opportunities, but it's also shown me the limitations of a life focused purely on accumulating wealth. There's something to be said for work that connects you to the land, to the rhythm of seasons, and the satisfaction of raising something from nothing. As the evening progressed, their conversation ranged from practical matters of ranch management to broader questions about life goals and personal values. Clara found herself sharing thoughts and feelings she'd kept private since Thomas's death, while Colt revealed glimpses of the experiences that had shaped his own worldview. "Mrs. Tisdale," he said as the hour grew late, "I hope you won't think me forward, but I've come to value these conversations more than I initially expected. It's been a long time since I've had the opportunity to discuss serious matters with someone whose judgment I respect so completely." The compliment was carefully worded to avoid inappropriate implications while acknowledging the personal dimension their relationship had acquired. Clara felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the tea or the fire crackling in the fireplace, a recognition that she'd been starved for exactly this kind of intellectual and emotional connection. "I feel the same way," she replied honestly. "These discussions have reminded me how much I missed having someone to share ideas with, someone who values thoughtful conversation over idle gossip." The admission hung between them for a moment, both recognizing that they'd crossed into territory that went beyond professional courtesy. Yet there was nothing inappropriate in their exchange, merely the acknowledgement of mutual respect and growing friendship between two people who had found in each other something they hadn't realized they were missing. "There's something else I wanted to discuss with you," Colt said, his tone becoming more businesslike as if he recognized the need to return to safer ground. "I've been thinking about expanding our operations more quickly than originally planned. The market conditions are favorable, and I have access to additional capital if we can identify profitable opportunities." Clara welcomed the shift back to business matters, though she was aware that their personal connection would continue to influence their working relationship in ways that were both promising and potentially complicated. "What kind of expansion are you considering?" she asked, grateful for the chance to focus on practical matters where her expertise was clearly valued. "Additional land primarily. There are several properties adjacent to ours that might become available, and I'd like your assessment of their potential value. Beyond that, I'm interested in your opinion about diversifying our operations, perhaps adding sheep or horses to our cattle operation." The discussion that followed was detailed and technical, covering everything from water rights to market access to the seasonal labor requirements of different types of livestock. Clara found herself energized by the challenge of thinking strategically about the ranch's future, of considering possibilities that went far beyond simple survival to encompass real prosperity and growth. As Colt prepared to leave, Clara realized that the evening had marked a significant shift in their relationship. They had moved beyond the careful formality of employer and employee to something approaching true partnership, with all the opportunities and complications that such a development implied. "Thank you for the tea and the conversation," Colt said as he stood to go. "Both were exactly what I needed after a day of wrestling with correspondence from Chicago." "Thank you for trusting me with your concerns about the business," Clara replied. "I hope I've been helpful." "More than helpful," he assured her. "Having someone to discuss these matters with has clarified my own thinking considerably. I'm more convinced than ever that this ranch represents the right path forward, both professionally and personally." After he left, Clara remained in her sitting area, surrounded by the delicate china that connected her to her mother's memory and the warm atmosphere that had made the evening so satisfying. The baby moved restlessly within her, as if responding to her elevated emotional state, and she found herself speaking quietly to the child she carried. "Your future is looking brighter every day, little one," she whispered, her hand resting on her belly. "We're building something here that will last, something you can be proud of." But even as hope filled her heart, Clara was aware of the complexities that lay ahead. Her growing personal feelings for Colt were becoming harder to ignore, despite her determination to maintain appropriate boundaries. The letters from Chicago suggested that his past might intrude on their carefully constructed present in ways she couldn't anticipate. Most challenging of all, she was beginning to understand that her identity was shifting from Thomas Tisdale's widow to something new and undefined, a transformation that felt both liberating and frightening. The china. Teacups sat on their tray, beautiful and fragile reminders that some things required careful handling to preserve their value. As Clara prepared for bed, she found herself hoping that whatever developed between herself and Colt would prove as enduring as it was delicate, as worthy of preservation as the precious porcelain that had survived the journey from her mother's parlor to this frontier ranch house. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning in late March, delivered by young Billy Henley, who had ridden hard from town with the urgent message. Clara was in the ranch office reviewing the weekly payroll when she heard the rapid hoofbeats approaching, followed by Billy's breathless call for Mr. Remington. The yellow Western Union envelope seemed to carry an ominous weight as eyes. Billy handed it over, his excitement at being entrusted with such important business obvious, despite his attempts to appear professional. Clara watched through the office window as Colt read the message, noting how his expression darkened with each line, his usual composed demeanor giving way to something approaching distress. When he entered the office moments later, the telegram clutched in his hand, Clara could see that whatever news it contained had shaken him more deeply than anything she'd witnessed during their months of working together. "Bad news from Chicago?" she asked, though his expression had already answered her question. Colt sank into the chair across from her desk, the telegram still gripped in his fingers, as if he were reluctant to set it down and make its contents. "Real. My business partner, Edmund Hartley, has been arrested for embezzlement. Large amounts of money have gone missing from our joint accounts, and the authorities seem to believe I might be involved." The words hit Clara like a physical blow, not because she believed Colt capable of such crimes, but because she understood immediately how devastating such accusations could be to everything they'd built together. In her experience, suspicion spread faster than fire and was often just as destructive, regardless of its ultimate truth or falsehood. "What exactly are they saying?" she asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her heart. "The telegram is from my attorney," Colt replied, finally setting the message on her desk where she could read it. "He says the authorities want to question me about my knowledge of Hartley's activities, particularly regarding several transactions that occurred just before I left Chicago. There's also mention of missing documentation that might implicate me in the scheme." Clara read the telegram carefully, noting the lawyer's careful language that managed to convey urgency while avoiding specific accusations. It was the kind of communication that suggested serious legal jeopardy while maintaining enough ambiguity to avoid creating additional problems. "Do you have any idea how this could have happened?" she asked. Colt was quiet for a long moment, his eyes focused on something beyond the office window as he considered her question. "Edmund and I have been partners for nearly 8 years. I trusted him completely, perhaps more than I should have. He handled most of our day-to-day financial operations, while I focused on identifying new investment opportunities. If he's been systematically stealing from our accounts, he could have been covering his tracks for months or even years." The explanation was plausible, but Clara could hear the doubt in Colt's voice, the recognition that his trust might have been misplaced in ways that could destroy everything he'd worked to build. She also noticed that he hadn't directly answered her question about his own involvement, an omission that might mean nothing or everything, depending on circumstances she couldn't evaluate. "What will you do?" she asked. "I have to return to Chicago immediately," Colt said, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that clearly pained him. "My attorney says the authorities are prepared to issue a warrant for my arrest if I don't." Cooperate voluntarily. Even if I'm completely innocent, fighting these charges from a distance would be impossible. The prospect of Colt's departure filled Clara with a complex mixture of fear and disappointment that she struggled to keep hidden. Over the past months, she had built her entire future around their partnership, both professional and personal. His absence would leave her in an impossible position, neither fully authorized to make major decisions about the ranch, nor able to simply abandon the responsibilities she'd accepted. "How long do you expect to be gone?" she asked, though she suspected he had no way of knowing. "I honestly don't know," Colt admitted. "Legal proceedings can drag on for months, especially when they involve complex financial matters. Even if I'm cleared of all charges, rebuilding my business relationships and reputation could take considerable time." The implications of his words settled between them like a gathering storm. Everything they'd planned, all the careful work of building the ranch and establishing their partnership, now hung in the balance of legal proceedings neither of them could control or predict. "What about the ranch?" Clara asked, though she was really asking about her own future and that of her unborn child. "That's what I need to discuss with you," Colt said, his expression growing more intense. "I'm hoping you'll be willing to take full responsibility for operations here while I'm away. I know it's an enormous burden, especially with your baby due in just 2 months, but you're the only person I trust completely to protect what we've built." The request was both flattering and terrifying. Clara had never managed an operation of this scope entirely on her own, and doing so while pregnant added complications she could barely imagine. Yet the alternative, allowing the ranch to fail while Colt fought for his freedom in Chicago, was unthinkable. "I'll do whatever needs to be done," she said, though her voice betrayed some of the uncertainty she felt. "I knew I could count on you," Colt replied, relief evident in his expression. "I'll make arrangements for additional help with the heavier work, and I'll ensure you have access to sufficient funds to handle any emergencies that arise. But more than that, I want to make sure you're protected if things go badly for me in Chicago." "What do you mean?" Colt reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document that Clara recognized as some kind of legal paper. "I've had my lawyer prepare a transfer of ownership that would give you full title to the ranch and all its assets if I'm convicted of these charges or if I die while fighting them. It's my way of ensuring that your future is secure regardless of what happens to me." The gesture was so unexpected, so generous, that Clara felt tears prick at her eyes despite her efforts to maintain composure. The document represented not just financial security, but recognition of her value as a partner and her right to the life they'd been building together. "Colt, I can't accept something this valuable," she protested, though her heart yearned to accept the security he was offering. "You can and you will," he replied firmly. "Mrs. Tisdale." "Clara, you've given me something I thought I'd lost forever. Chance to build something meaningful with someone I respect and care about. If my past mistakes destroy that opportunity, the least I can do is ensure that you and your child have the chance to continue what we started." The use of her first name, spoken with such tenderness, revealed feelings that had been growing between them, despite their careful maintenance of professional boundaries. Clara realized that her own emotions had evolved far beyond mere respect and friendship, though she'd been reluctant to acknowledge the depth of her attachment. "What if you're cleared of these charges?" she asked. "What if you come back and want to reclaim everything?" "Then we'll discuss the arrangements that work best for both of us," Colt said. "But Clara, I need you to understand that even if I'm completely exonerated, my reputation may be permanently damaged. I may never be able to return to the kind of business I conducted in Chicago, which means this ranch might represent my only path to rebuilding my life." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses, and Clara looked out to see Jake Morrison riding up with 2 of the ranch hands. The ordinary business of running the operation continued regardless of the crisis that had just upended their personal world, and she realized that maintaining that normalcy would be one of her greatest challenges in the months ahead. "I should tell Jake about the change in management," Colt said, standing and straightening his coat as if preparing for a difficult conversation. "What will you tell him about the reasons for your departure?" Clara asked, aware that the explanation would likely spread throughout the community within days. As little as possible, Colt replied. Business emergency in Chicago requiring extended attention. The less said about legal troubles, the better for everyone involved. As they walked outside to meet with Jake Morrison, Clara felt the weight of the responsibility she was accepting settling onto her shoulders like a heavy cloak. In a matter of hours, she had gone from respected ranch manager to sole proprietor of one of the valley's most ambitious enterprises. From pregnant widow with uncertain prospects to woman of substantial property and influence. Yet she was also aware that her elevated status was built on foundations that might prove temporary. If Colt's legal troubles destroyed his reputation permanently, her association with him could taint her own standing in the community. If the charges against him proved true, she might find herself managing an operation built with stolen money, a situation that would create moral and legal complications she was ill-equipped to handle. The baby moved restlessly within her as if responding to her emotional turmoil, and Clara found herself placing a protective hand over her belly. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she was no longer making decisions only for herself. Her child's future now depended on her ability to navigate the complex situation Colt's departure would create, to preserve what they'd built while protecting herself and her baby from the consequences of circumstances beyond her control. As Jake Morrison approached with his characteristic steady gait and curious expression, Clara straightened her shoulders and prepared to step into a role she'd never imagined occupying. The telegram that had shattered their carefully planned future had also opened possibilities she was only beginning to understand, opportunities that carried both promise and peril in equal measure. Sheriff Morrison arrived at the ranch on a gray April morning, his weathered face bearing the grim expression of a man who had ridden far to deliver unwelcome news. Clara was reviewing breeding records in the ranch office when she heard the familiar cadence of his horse's hoofbeats, a sound that instantly transported her back to that terrible October day when he'd brought word of Thomas's death. The wanted poster he carried was still damp with morning dew, its bold black letters stark against the pale paper. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she accepted the document, though whether from her advanced pregnancy or the shock of seeing Colt's name printed beneath the word wanted, she couldn't say. Edmund Hartley and Associates, Chicago Financial Crimes, read the header, followed by a detailed description of charges that made Clara's blood run cold. The accusations were far more serious than the vague embezzlement concerns mentioned in the telegram. According to the poster, Colt was suspected of systematically defrauding investors of more than $50,000, using falsified documents and phantom investments to line his own pockets. Mrs. Tisdale, Sheriff Morrison said gently, his voice carrying the kind of careful neutrality that lawmen used when delivering devastating news to people they respected. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad tidings, but I thought you should know what's being said about your employer before word spreads through town. Clara forced herself to read every word of the poster, searching for details that might explain how the man she'd come to trust and care for could be accused of such elaborate crimes. The description of the alleged scheme was complex and convincing, involving multiple false identities, forged documents, and a pattern of deception that spanned several years. Have these charges been proven? She asked, though her heart was already sinking as she absorbed the implications. Not yet, the sheriff replied. But the federal marshals seem mighty confident about their case. They say Hartley's been cooperating with their investigation and has provided evidence that directly implicates Remington in the scheme. Word is they expect to arrest him within the week. The news hit Clara like a physical blow, not just because of what it suggested about Colt's character, but because of what it meant for her own situation. If the charges were true, everything she'd built her future around was founded on stolen money. The ranch, her position, even the legal documents giving her ownership rights, all of it could be seized by federal authorities as proceeds of criminal activity. What does this mean for the ranch operations? She asked, struggling to maintain her composure despite the chaos in her mind. Well, that's complicated, Sheriff Morrison admitted. Legally speaking, if Remington purchased this property with stolen funds, the federal government could seize it as evidence. But they'd have to prove the connection between the alleged crimes and the ranch purchases, which might not be straightforward given the timing involved. Clara's mind raced through the chronology of Colt's land purchases and improvements, trying to remember when various payments had been made and from which accounts. The careful records she'd been keeping might now serve as evidence in a criminal case rather than simple business documentation. "Sheriff," she said carefully, "I need you to understand that I had no knowledge of any illegal activities. My work here has been limited to ranch management and local consulting. I never had access to Mr. Remington's financial records or information about his business operations in Chicago." "I believe you, Mrs. Tisdale," Morrison replied, though his expression suggested the distinction might not matter to federal investigators. "But you should know that they'll likely want to question you about your relationship with Remington and what you might have observed during your time working together." The prospect of federal interrogation while 8 months pregnant was daunting enough, but Clara was more concerned about the broader implications for her reputation and future. Once again, she found herself associated with a man accused of serious crimes, her judgment and character called into question by circumstances largely beyond her control. "There's something else," Sheriff Morrison continued, his reluctance to share additional bad news obvious in his hesitation. "The poster mentions that Remington might be traveling under false documentation. If that's true, we might not even know his real name or background." This possibility struck Clara as particularly devastating. The man she'd come to trust, whose child she'd considered raising alongside her own, might be an elaborate fiction created to facilitate criminal activity. Every conversation they'd shared, every moment of apparent sincerity, could have been part of an extended deception designed to establish credibility while he planned his next crime. Yet even as these dark possibilities swirled through her mind, Clara found herself struggling to reconcile the accusations with her personal experience of Colt's character. The man she'd worked with daily for months had shown consistent integrity in his dealings with employees, neighbors, and business partners. His knowledge of ranching and investment principles seemed genuine, not the superficial understanding a confidence man might acquire for deceptive purposes. "Sheriff," she said finally, "I appreciate you bringing this information directly to me rather than letting me hear it as gossip. But I need time to think about what this means and how to respond." "Of course," Morrison replied, standing to leave. "But Mrs. Tisdale, I'd advise you to be very careful about any major decisions regarding ranch operations until this situation gets sorted out. And if Remington contacts you, you should let me know immediately." After the sheriff left, Clara remained in the office staring at the wanted poster, trying to make sense of information that contradicted everything she thought she knew about the man who had transformed her life. The document painted a picture of systematic fraud and elaborate deception, crimes that required the kind of calculated dishonesty that seemed incompatible with the thoughtful, principled person she'd come to know. The baby kicked forcefully, as if responding to her emotional turmoil, and Clara realized that her distress was affecting the child she carried. She forced herself to take slow, deep breaths, trying to calm her racing heart and focus on what she could control rather than the uncertainties that surrounded her. The sound of approaching horses drew her attention to the window, where she saw Jake Morrison riding up with several of the ranch hands. News of the wanted poster would spread quickly through the small ranching community, and she would need to address the concerns and questions of employees who depended on the ranch for their livelihoods. But as Clara prepared to face the immediate, practical challenges, her mind kept returning to more personal questions that might never be answered satisfactorily. Had Colt's kindness toward her been genuine, or simply part of an elaborate performance designed to win her trust and cooperation? Were the feelings she'd developed for him based on real understanding of his character, or had she fallen in love with a carefully constructed persona that bore no resemblance to the man behind it? The legal documents transferring ownership of the ranch to her in case of Colt's conviction now took on a different significance. What she'd interpreted as generosity might actually be a criminal's attempt to hide stolen assets from federal seizure. Her acceptance of the arrangement could make her an unwitting accomplice to money laundering, regardless of her innocent intentions. Clara placed the wanted poster in her desk drawer, unable to bear looking at it, but unwilling to destroy what might be important evidence. The accusations it contained would need to be addressed. But for now, she had to focus on maintaining ranch operations and protecting the people who depended on her leadership. As she walked outside to meet with Jake Morrison and address his inevitable questions, Clara reflected on the bitter irony of her situation. She had spent months building a new life based on trust and mutual respect, only to discover that the foundation might be built on lies and stolen money. The future she'd envisioned for herself and her child was once again shrouded in uncertainty, dependent on factors she couldn't control or fully understand. Yet, Clara also recognized that she had gained something valuable during her months at the ranch that couldn't be taken away by federal marshals or criminal charges. She had rediscovered her own capabilities and worth, proven to herself and others that she possessed the skills and knowledge needed to succeed in business and community leadership. Whatever the truth about Colt Remington might be, the confidence and experience she'd gained working beside him remained real and valuable. The baby moved again within her, a reminder that her decisions would affect more than just her own future. As Clara prepared to navigate the crisis that Colt's departure and a federal investigation would create, she found herself drawing on reserves of strength and determination she developed during the darkest months after Thomas's death. Had survived one scandal and built a new life from its ashes. If necessary, she could do it again. The hidden letter Clara discovered 3 days after Sheriff Morrison's visit changed everything she thought she knew about love, loyalty, and the obligations of the living to the dead. She found it while packing away Thomas's remaining possessions, preparing to make room for the baby's needs. In her increasingly cramped quarters at the ranch house, the letter had been concealed behind a loose board in the small wooden box where Thomas kept his few valuable papers, his father's military discharge, their marriage certificate, and the deed to their original homestead. Written in Thomas's careful script, it was dated just 2 weeks before his fatal accident, suggesting he'd known something Clara had never suspected about his deteriorating health and limited time. "My dearest Clara Mae," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then God has seen fit to call me home earlier than we hoped, and you are facing the future alone. I know this brings you pain, but I pray it also brings you the freedom to find happiness in ways that our life together could not provide." Clara's hands trembled as she continued reading, Thomas's words revealing knowledge and understanding she'd never credited him with possessing. He had known about his weak heart, the condition that made his accident, not the random tragedy she'd believed, but an almost inevitable conclusion to a life lived on borrowed time. Asterisk, I have seen how you look at the horizon sometimes, as if searching for something our simple life cannot offer. I have watched you bite back opinions and ideas that might challenge my more limited understanding of the world. You married a good man, Clara, but perhaps not the right man for someone with your intelligence and ambitions. The words cut deep, not because they were cruel, but because they were so perceptive. Thomas had understood aspects of their marriage that Clara herself had refused to acknowledge, recognizing that her contentment with their life had been achieved, partly by suppressing parts of herself that yearned for broader horizons. If you find yourself caring for another man after I'm gone, do not let guilt about my memory hold you back from happiness. I want you to build the kind of life you deserve, even if it's different from what we shared. The baby you carry will benefit from having a mother who is truly fulfilled, rather than one who sacrifices her own possibilities out of misplaced loyalty to a dead man's memory. Clara wiped away tears that blurred her vision as she continued reading, amazed by the depth of Thomas's insight into her character and needs. He had somehow understood that her greatest challenge after his death would not be practical survival, but emotional permission to move beyond the life they'd shared. I know people will judge you for any choices you make that seem to dishonor my memory, but Clara, I give you my blessing to love again, to marry again, to build whatever future will make you and our child happiest. You owe the living more than you owe the dead, and I was never so selfish as to want my death to become a prison for your heart. The letter concluded with practical instructions about hidden savings and business contacts, but Clara barely absorbed these details. The emotional impact of Thomas's words had shattered the guilt and uncertainty that had clouded her feelings for Colt Remington, replacing them with a clarity that was both liberating and terrifying. Thomas had not only given her permission to love again, he had encouraged it, recognizing that her happiness and their child's welfare might depend on finding a partner who could offer more than he had been able to provide. The timing of this discovery, coming just as federal authorities were preparing to arrest the man she'd grown to care for, seemed like a cruel joke played by fate. Clara was still absorbing the implications of Thomas's letter when Jake Morrison arrived with news that federal marshals had reached Millbrook and were setting up their investigation at the hotel. The reality of Colt's situation was no longer a distant threat, but an immediate crisis that would determine the future of everyone connected to the ranch. "They're asking questions about the ranch's finances," Jake reported, his weathered face showing the strain of trying to maintain normal operations while surrounded by federal investigators. "Wanting to see records, talking to suppliers and contractors about how payments were made. Word is they're building a case that the whole operation was funded with stolen money." Clara felt the baby move restlessly within her, responding to her elevated stress, as the child often did during moments of crisis. At 8.5 months pregnant, she was physically uncomfortable under the best of circumstances, but the emotional turmoil of the past few days had left her exhausted and struggling to maintain the clear thinking the situation demanded. "Have they asked to interview me yet?" she asked, though she suspected it was only a matter of time. "Not yet, but I expect they will soon. Mrs. Tisdale, I have to ask, did you have any suspicions about where Mr. Remington's money came from? Anything that seemed unusual about his business practices or financial arrangements?" The question forced Clara to examine her months of working with Colt through the lens of criminal suspicion rather than professional collaboration. Had there been signs she'd missed, inconsistencies that should have raised red flags about the source of his apparent wealth? Nothing concrete, she admitted. He was always well-funded, sometimes surprisingly so for someone supposedly investing his own savings in a speculative ranch operation. But he explained that as having multiple business interests and access to investment capital through his Chicago partnerships. "And you believed him?" Clara considered the question carefully, recognizing that her answer would reveal as much about her own judgment as about Colt's credibility. "I wanted to believe him," she said finally. His explanation seemed reasonable, and his knowledge of business and investment principles appeared genuine. More than that, he treated everyone fairly and honestly in all his local dealings. Jake nodded thoughtfully, his expression suggesting he was wrestling with similar contradictions between the federal accusations and his own observations of Colt's character. That's what makes this whole situation so confusing. If he's the kind of criminal they say he is, he's been awfully good at maintaining the pretense of honest dealing. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a rider carrying another telegram, this one addressed directly to Clara. With growing dread, she opened the message and found words that crystallized her worst fears about Colt's fate and her own precarious position. "Federal warrant issued. Stop Remington arrested. Chicago. Stop assets frozen pending investigation. Stop advise immediate. Cessation all ranch operations. Stop federal seizure likely. Stop Attorney Davidson." The telegram represented the collapse of everything Clara had built over the past months. If federal authorities seized the ranch as proceeds of criminal activity, she would lose not just her employment, but her home, returning to the desperate poverty she'd fought so hard to escape. Worse, she would face the birth of her child without resources, support, or prospects for rebuilding her life. Yet even as panic threatened to overwhelm her rational thinking, Clara found herself clinging to Thomas's words about her obligations to the living rather than the dead. Her first responsibility was to her unborn child, whose welfare depended on her ability to navigate this crisis with courage and intelligence rather than despair. "Jake," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "I need you to gather all the ranch hands for a meeting. They deserve to know what's happening and what it might mean for their employment. And I need to review all our financial records before the federal marshals arrive with seizure orders." "Mrs. Tisdale," Jake said quietly, "I want you to know that whatever happens with the legal situation, the folks around here have seen how you've handled yourself these past months. That kind of reputation can't be taken away by federal marshals or criminal charges against someone else." The encouragement was welcome, But Clara knew that reputation alone wouldn't feed her baby or provide shelter through the coming winter. She needed to find a way to protect at least some of what she'd built, to salvage enough from the wreckage of Colt's apparent criminality to ensure her child's survival and future opportunities as evening approached, and Clara prepared for what might be her last night in the ranch house she'd come to consider home. She found herself returning repeatedly to Thomas's letter. His words about her obligations to the living had taken on new urgency as she faced the possibility of losing everything she'd worked to build. The baby kicked forcefully, as if reminding her that time was running short for making the decisions that would shape both their futures. Clara placed her hand on her belly and spoke quietly to the child within, drawing strength from the knowledge that she was no longer making choices only for herself. "Tomorrow we face whatever comes next," she whispered. "But we face it with clear eyes and strong hearts, just like your father would have wanted." The federal marshals would arrive with their questions and seizure orders, determined to unravel what they believed was an elaborate criminal enterprise. Colt would face trial for crimes that could destroy his life and reputation permanently. But Clara Mae Tisdale would meet these challenges with the same determination that had carried her through previous trials, armed now with Thomas's blessing and her own hard-won understanding of her capabilities and worth. The letter that had revealed so much about Thomas's character and wisdom remained on her desk, a tangible reminder that love sometimes meant giving the people you care about permission to move beyond the limitations of shared history. As Clara prepared for the confrontation that would determine her future, she carried with her the knowledge that she had been loved enough to be set free, trusted enough to make her own choices about the path ahead. Whatever tomorrow brought, she would face it as a woman empowered by understanding rather than constrained by guilt, determined to build a life worthy of the trust both Thomas and her unborn child had placed in her wisdom. And strengthed out the federal marshals arrived at dawn, with a wagon full of ledgers and the grim efficiency of men accustomed to dismantling the lives of accused criminals. Clara met them in the ranch office, her advanced pregnancy making it difficult to rise from her chair with dignity, but her voice steady as she offered them access to whatever records they required. Marshal Henry Caldwell, a thin man with steel gray eyes and the bearing of someone who had seen too much human duplicity to be easily impressed, spread Colt's business ledgers across her desk with the methodical care of an accountant preparing for an audit. The leather-bound volumes that had once represented careful planning and legitimate business practices now appeared as potential evidence in a criminal conspiracy. Asterisk, Mrs. Tisdale, Marshal Caldwell said, his voice carrying the neutral tone that law enforcement officers used when questioning potential witnesses. These records suggest that Mr. Remington invested over $40,000 in this ranch operation during the past 6 months. Can you verify the accuracy of these figures? Clara studied the ledger entries, recognizing her own handwriting alongside Colt's more elaborate script. The numbers were accurate, but seeing them presented as evidence of criminal activity rather than successful business development created a surreal disconnect between her memories and the marshal's implications. "The figures appear correct," she sighed carefully. Mr. Remington was well-funded and committed to building a first-class operation. "According to our investigation," Marshal Caldwell continued, "approximately $35,000 of that investment can be traced directly to fraudulent transactions conducted by his Chicago partnership. That would make this entire ranch operation proceeds of criminal activity subject to federal seizure." The words hit Clara like physical blows, each dollar amount representing hopes and plans that were now being redefined as stolen property. Yet as she listened to the marshal's accusations, she found herself focusing on discrepancies that suggested the situation might be more complex than the federal authorities assumed. "Marshal," she said, her mind racing through the chronology of Colt's investments, "I've been keeping detailed records of all ranch expenditures and improvements. Would it be helpful if I showed you exactly when various purchases were made and from which accounts the payments came?" Marshal Caldwell's expression sharpened with interest. "You have documentation that breaks down the source of funding for specific purchases?" "I do," Clara replied, reaching for the filing system she'd meticulously maintained throughout her tenure as ranch manager. Mr. Remington was very particular about keeping separate records for different aspects of his business operations. As Clara began laying out the detailed financial records she'd maintained. She noticed patterns that hadn't been apparent when viewed individually. The timeline of major investments corresponded closely with Colt's letters from various Chicago banks and investment firms, suggesting that his funding had come from multiple legitimate sources rather than a single fraudulent scheme. "Marshall, look at this," she said, pointing to a series of entries from January and February. These payments for cattle purchases and equipment came from the First National Bank of Chicago, not from the accounts controlled by his partnership with Edmund Hartley. And these construction payments were drawn on his personal account at Illinois Merchants Bank. Marshall Caldwell studied the records with growing attention, his initial confidence in the case against Colt beginning to show signs of uncertainty. "You're suggesting that Mr. Remington maintained legitimate funding sources separate from his allegedly fraudulent partnership?" "I'm suggesting that the financial picture might be more complicated than your investigation initially indicated," Clara replied diplomatically. "Mr. Remington always spoke of having multiple business interests and investment streams. These records support that claim." As they continued reviewing the documentation, Clara became increasingly convinced that Colt had been deliberately framed by his partner Edmund Hartley. The pattern of legitimate transactions she was documenting suggested that most of Colt's wealth had come from sources unconnected to the alleged embezzlement scheme. "Mrs. Tisdale," Marshall Caldwell said after an hour of careful review, "do you have any knowledge of how Mr. Remington's legitimate funds might have been mixed with proceeds from the alleged crimes?" The question revealed that the federal case was built on assumptions that might not withstand careful scrutiny. If Colt's ranch investments had been funded primarily through legitimate channels, the government's ability to seize the property would be significantly compromised. "Marshall," Clara said, feeling her confidence grow as she recognized the implications of what they were discovering, "I think you need to consider the possibility that Mr. Remington was betrayed by his partner, rather than being a willing participant in criminal activity." "What do you mean?" Clara took a deep breath, recognizing that her next words could either help clear Colt's name or make her appear to be an accomplice attempting to obstruct justice. Edmund Hartley had access to all their joint accounts and business records. If he wanted to frame Mr. Remington for his own crimes, he could have created false documentation that made legitimate transactions appear to be connected to the embezzlement scheme. The silence that followed her observation was broken by the sound of approaching horses. Through the office window, Clara saw a sight that made her heart race. Colt Remington riding up the ranch drive with two men she didn't recognize. All of them moving with the urgency of people who had traveled hard to reach their destination. "Marshall," she said quietly, "I believe Mr. Remington has returned to face these charges directly." Marshall Caldwell's hand moved instinctively toward his sidearm as he watched Colt dismount and walk toward the office with the steady gait of a man who had come to confront his accusers rather than flee from them. The confidence in his bearing suggested either complete innocence or remarkable self-control in the face of certain arrest. "Mr. Remington," the marshal called as Colt reached the office door, "I have a federal warrant for your arrest on charges of embezzlement and fraud." "I expected as much," Colt replied calmly, his eyes finding Clara's across the room with an expression that combined relief at seeing her safe with regret for the difficulties his situation had created. "But before you place me under arrest, I believe these gentlemen have information that will interest you greatly." The two men who had accompanied Colt stepped forward with the bearing of professionals delivering crucial evidence. The older of the two, a well-dressed man with the bearing of a successful attorney, carried a leather portfolio that he set carefully on Clara's desk. "Marshall Caldwell," the attorney said, "my name is James Patterson, and I represent the Chicago Board of Trade's investigation into financial crimes. This is Detective William Hayes of the Chicago Police Department. We have evidence that will substantially alter your understanding of this case." Detective Hayes, a compact man with intelligent eyes and the weathered hands of someone who had spent years investigating complex crimes, began removing documents from the portfolio with practiced efficiency. 3 days ago, Edmund Hartley attempted to flee Chicago with over $60,000 in cash and bearer bonds. When we arrested him, he was carrying documentation that proves he systematically forged records to make his own thefts appear to be joint ventures with Mr. Remington. Clara felt a surge of vindication that was quickly followed by concern for how this revelation would affect Colt's legal situation. Even if he was cleared of the embezzlement charges, the damage to his reputation and business relationships might be irreparable. "Are you saying that Mr. Remington is innocent of these charges?" Marshal Caldwell asked, his tone suggesting he was struggling to adjust his understanding of the case. "Not only innocent," Attorney Patterson replied, "but actually the victim of an elaborate fraud designed to destroy his reputation while covering Hartley's tracks. The evidence we've assembled shows that Mr. Remington's investments in this ranch were funded entirely through legitimate sources, while Hartley used forged documents to make those transactions appear connected to his embezzlement scheme. As the federal investigators began reviewing the new evidence, Clara found herself studying Colt's face for signs of how this ordeal had affected him. The man who returned to face these charges appeared older and more careworn than the one who had left for Chicago, but his fundamental character seemed unchanged by the experience of being accused of serious crimes. As the federal investigators concluded their review of the evidence that cleared Colt's name, Clara felt the weight of months of uncertainty lifting from her shoulders. The man she had come to love was not a criminal, and the life they had built together was not founded on stolen money. Yet even as relief flooded through her, she was aware that their relationship had been forever changed by the crisis they had. Weathered. Marshal Caldwell formally apologized to Colt for the disruption to his life and business, acknowledging that the federal investigation had been misled by Edmund Hartley's sophisticated frame-up scheme. The warrant for Colt's arrest was withdrawn, and orders were issued to release the freeze on his assets and business accounts. "Mr. Remington," the marshal said as he prepared to leave, "I want to commend you for returning to face these charges, rather than attempting to flee. That decision ultimately helped us uncover the truth about your partner's crimes." After the federal officials departed, Clara found herself alone with Colt for the first time since his hasty departure for Chicago weeks earlier. The man who stood before her had been tested by circumstances that would have broken someone of lesser character, and she could see that the experience had refined rather than diminished his essential strength. "Clara," he said quietly, his voice carrying emotions he had clearly been holding in check during the official proceedings, "I owe you an apology for bringing this trouble into your life. When I offered you a partnership in this ranch, I never imagined it would subject you to federal investigation and the threat of losing everything we'd built." "You don't owe me any apology," Clara replied, rising from her chair with some difficulty as her pregnancy neared its conclusion. "You were the victim of a sophisticated fraud, not the perpetrator of crimes. If anyone should apologize, it's me for doubting your character even briefly." Colt moved closer, his eyes taking in the visible signs of how her pregnancy had progressed during his absence. "Clara, these past weeks in Chicago, fighting to clear my name and restore my reputation, made me realize something I should have acknowledged long ago. This ranch, this life we've built together, none of it means anything to me without you as my true partner." The words carried implications that went far beyond their business relationship, and Clara felt her heart racing as she recognized that Colt was approaching territory they had both been careful to avoid despite their growing feelings for each other. "What are you saying?" she asked, though her heart had already begun to hope for possibilities she'd barely dared to consider. Instead of answering with words, Colt dropped to one knee beside her chair, taking her hands in his with the reverent care of a man who understood the precious nature of what he was requesting. "Clara Mae Tisdale, I'm saying that I love you with every fiber of my being, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving myself worthy of the trust and affection you've shown me." The proposal was so unexpected, so perfectly timed after the resolution of his legal troubles, that Clara felt tears springing to her eyes. Yet even as joy flooded through her, she was aware of the practical complexities that would accompany such a marriage. "Colt," she said softly, "I'm 8.5 months pregnant with another man's child. Are you certain you're ready for the challenges that would bring?" "Clara," he replied with conviction that silenced her doubts, "I've spent months watching. You build a life of dignity and purpose from circumstances that would have defeated someone of lesser character. That child you're carrying is part of you, which means it's already precious to me. I want the honor of being its father in every way that matters." The words echoed Thomas's letter in their recognition that the most profound love sometimes meant embracing realities that went beyond conventional expectations. Clara realized that Colt was offering her exactly what Thomas had hoped she would find: a partnership that honored her full worth while providing security and happiness for both her and her child. "Yes," she said simply, the word carrying months of suppressed hope and carefully guarded affection. "Yes, I will marry you." As Colt slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, a ring that had belonged to his grandmother and had traveled with him through all his business ventures as a reminder of enduring love, Clara became aware that they were no longer alone. Through the office window, she could see that word of Colt's return and vindication had spread through the ranch, drawing workers and neighbors who had come to witness the resolution of the crisis that had threatened their community. Jake Morrison stood in the doorway with a broad smile, having obviously heard enough of their conversation to understand what was being celebrated. "Mrs. Tisdale," he said with formal courtesy that barely concealed his delight, "am I to understand that congratulations are in order?" "You are indeed," Colt replied, standing and helping Clara to her feet with the careful attention her condition required. "Mrs. Tisdale has agreed to become Mrs. Remington, and I hope you'll all join us in celebrating both our engagement and the successful resolution of the legal troubles that have plagued our operations." The news spread through the gathering crowd with the speed of prairie wildfire, generating expressions of joy and relief that reflected the community's investment in Clara's happiness and the ranch's continued success. In a matter of minutes, what had begun as a federal criminal investigation had transformed into an impromptu engagement celebration. Reverend Patterson, who had arrived with his wife to offer support during what they'd expected to be a difficult day, stepped forward with the bearing of a man who recognized an opportunity to serve his community in a meaningful way. "Mr. Remington, Mrs. Tisdale," he said formally, "if you're planning to marry, I would be honored to perform the ceremony. Given Mrs. Tisdale's condition, I imagine you'll want to formalize your union as soon as possible." The suggestion prompted Clara to consider the practical timeline of their situation. Her baby was due within the next few weeks, and she wanted the security of marriage established before facing the challenges and uncertainties of childbirth. "Reverend," she said, "would it be possible to perform the ceremony this afternoon? I know it's short notice, but given the circumstances... "My dear," Reverend Patterson replied with warmth, "some of life's most important decisions should be acted upon quickly, before doubt or difficulty can interfere. If you and Mr. Remington are certain of your commitment to each other, I see no reason to delay the formalization of your union." As the crowd dispersed to spread word of the impromptu wedding and gather the simple preparations such a ceremony would require, Clara found herself marveling at how quickly her life had transformed from crisis to celebration. The morning had begun with federal marshals threatening to seize everything she'd worked to build, and now it was ending with the promise of marriage to the man she loved and security for the child she carried. The marriage certificate that would soon bear their names represented more than legal documentation. It symbolized the triumph of trust over suspicion, love over fear, and hope over the forces that had tried to destroy what they'd built together. As Clara prepared for her wedding to Colt Remington, she carried with her Thomas's blessing and the knowledge that she was choosing not just personal happiness, but the foundation for her child's future prosperity. The baby moved vigorously within her, as if responding to her elevated emotions, and Clara placed her hand over her belly with gratitude for the life she was about to bring into a world that suddenly seemed full of possibility rather than threat. In a few hours, she would become Mrs. Colt Remington, and tomorrow she would begin building the life that both her past and future had prepared her to embrace. Spring arrived early that year, painting the Wyoming Valley in shades of green that seemed to celebrate the new life growing in every corner of the landscape. Clara stood at the window of the ranch house nursery, her daughter Sarah Elizabeth sleeping peacefully in the hand-carved cradle that had become the centerpiece of their transformed home. The cradle itself was Colt's masterwork, crafted during the long winter evenings when Clara's pregnancy had kept her close to the fire and their conversations had ranged from practical ranch business to dreams for their growing family. Every curve and detail had been shaped with love. The smooth wood, polished to a lustrous finish that would withstand generations of use. It represented not just a piece of furniture, but a symbol of the permanence and stability they had built together. 3 months had passed since Sarah's birth, and Clara marveled daily at how completely the child had been embraced by Colt as his own daughter. He had been present during her difficult labor, holding Clara's hand and whispering encouragement as Dr. Mitchell worked to bring their baby safely into the world. When Sarah had finally arrived, small but perfectly formed, Colt had wept with joy as if witnessing the birth of his own flesh and blood. "She has your stubborn streak," Colt observed from the doorway, his voice carrying the amused affection of a man who had discovered that fatherhood suited him perfectly. Refusing to sleep when any reasonable baby would be exhausted, Clara smiled, turning to watch her husband approach with the careful steps of someone who had learned to move quietly around a sleeping infant. Marriage to Colt had brought joys she hadn't anticipated, chief among them the pleasure of sharing parental responsibilities with someone whose devotion to their child matched her own. "She's just alert," Clara replied, accepting Colt's embrace as they stood together watching their daughter. "Dr. Mitchell says intelligent babies often sleep less than others. She wants to be aware of everything happening around her." The observation was characteristic of how they had both chosen to interpret Sarah's early development. Rather than seeing her fussiness as a problem to be solved, they viewed her alertness and responsiveness as signs of the quick mind she had inherited from both her parents. "Jake stopped by earlier with the final tally from the spring cattle sale," Colt said, his tone carrying satisfaction that extended beyond mere financial success. "We exceeded our projections by nearly 15%. The reputation we've built for quality livestock is starting to pay dividends in the marketplace." The ranch's success represented more than business achievement. It validated the partnership Clara and Colt had forged through months of careful planning and hard work. Their operation had become a model for other ranchers in the valley, proof that intelligent management and attention to detail could overcome the challenges that defeated less methodical enterprises. "More importantly," Colt continued, "the success means we can begin planning the expansion we discussed. Additional land, larger herds, perhaps even the horse breeding operation you've been advocating." Clara felt a familiar thrill at the prospect of growth and new challenges. The ranch had given her a platform for using abilities she'd never fully realized she possessed, and each successful venture increased her confidence in their shared vision for the future. "There's something else I wanted to discuss with you," Colt said, his tone becoming more serious. "I received a letter yesterday from the territorial governor's office. They're looking for someone to serve on the commission that will plan Wyoming's transition to statehood. My name has been mentioned as a possible candidate." The honor was significant, representing recognition of Colt's growing influence in territorial business and political circles. Yet Clara understood that accepting such a position would require travel and time away from the ranch during critical periods. "What did you tell them?" she asked. "That I'd need to discuss it with my partner before making any commitments," Colt replied, his use of the word partner acknowledging that their marriage was built on shared decision-making rather than traditional hierarchies. The work would be important, but it would also mean being away from home for weeks at a time during legislative sessions. Clara considered the implications, weighing the benefits of political influence against the costs of Colt's absence during busy ranch seasons. More importantly, she recognized that his reluctance to accept was motivated primarily by concern for her welfare and their shared responsibilities. "I think you should accept," she said finally. "The territory needs thoughtful people involved in planning its future, and this ranch has proven we can manage temporary separations when necessary. Are you certain?" With Sarah still so young, and all the demands of managing the operation ... "Colt," Clara interrupted gently, "we've built something here that's bigger than either of us individually. The ranch runs well because we've hired good people and established sound systems. And I've managed before when circumstances required it." The conversation was interrupted by Sarah's awakening, her soft cries drawing their attention back to the cradle where she was beginning to stir. Clara lifted their daughter with practiced ease, marveling at how natural motherhood had become despite her initial concerns about raising a child alone. As she settled into the rocking chair to nurse Sarah, Clara reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment of contentment and security. The chair itself held memories of her first pregnancy, when she'd sat alone, wondering how she would provide for a child without resources or support. Now it represented the comfort and stability that loving partnership could create. "Clara," Colt said quietly, settling into the chair beside them, "I want you to know how grateful I am for the life we've built together. When I first came to this valley, I was running from disappointment and looking for a fresh start. I never imagined I'd find a partner who would transform not just my business prospects, but my understanding of what it means to be truly happy." Words carried the weight of sincere emotion, and Clara felt her heart swell with gratitude for the man who had seen her potential when others saw only problems. "I feel the same way," she replied. "You gave me the chance to discover capabilities I didn't know I possessed, and more importantly, you showed me that second chances at love are possible if you're brave enough to take them." As evening settled over the valley, Clara and Colt sat together in comfortable silence, watching their daughter nurse and listening to the sounds of the successful ranch operation winding down for the day. Through the window, they could see the lights beginning to twinkle in other homesteads scattered across the landscape, each representing families who had found ways to thrive in the challenging but rewarding environment of the frontier. The baby finished nursing and settled into sleep with the contentment of a child who had never known want or insecurity. Clara placed her in the cradle and pulled the soft blanket knitted by Martha Caldwell as a welcome gift up to her chin. "She'll grow up knowing she's wanted and loved," Clara observed, speaking as much to herself as to Colt. "That's a gift not every child receives." "She also grow up knowing that her mother is a woman of substance and accomplishment," Colt added. "That's equally important for a child's development." As they prepared for bed, Clara caught sight of herself in the mirror that hung above their dresser. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the desperate widow who had dragged firewood through the snow just over a year ago. This woman stood straight with confidence, her eyes bright with purpose and contentment, her bearing reflecting the security that came from knowing she was valued and loved. The transformation had been earned through courage, hard work, and the willingness to trust in possibilities that once seemed impossible. Clara Mae Remington, she still felt a thrill at her married name, had become everything Thomas had hoped for her when he wrote his final letter, encouraging her to embrace life fully rather than merely surviving it. Outside their window, the Wyoming wind sang through the pine trees with the eternal song of the frontier, promising challenges and opportunities in equal measure for those brave enough to meet them. Clara fell asleep listening to that wind, secure in the knowledge that whatever tomorrow might bring, she and Colt and Sarah would face it together as a family strong enough to build lasting happiness from the raw materials of hope, determination, and love. The cradle rocked gently in the night breeze. Empty now, but ready for the siblings Clara and Colt hoped would join Sarah in the years ahead. It stood as a testament to the enduring power of love to create something beautiful and permanent from the most challenging circumstances, a symbol of the legacy they were building for generations yet to come.